I'm Nick Smith in today for Nicole Burley. We begin with UFO whistleblower David Grush and his push for transparency that's now reaching the far ends of our globe. This after his exclusive interview right here on NewsNation. Grush speaking out once again, this time to the BBC. It comes just over a week after our report helped spark a historic hearing on Capitol Hill, which included testimony from Grush and two other former defense officials on what they have seen and experienced. In a moment, I'll speak with a former U.S. Navy officer about her experience as a pilot after several others in her field reported seeing a series of suspicious objects flying in highly restricted airspace over Arizona. But first, correspondent Evan Lambert is joining me live. Evan, Grush is responding to a statement from the head of the Pentagon's UFO office, responding to something that he said.
Nick, he is. This is a brand new interview with BBC Radio, and in it, we hear Grush push back against that top Pentagon official who called the congressional hearing on the subject of UFOs last week, quote, insulting, and then also said that Grush never worked for the office at the Pentagon that's responsible for investigating UFOs.
Dr. Kirkpatrick oversaw our activities and what we were doing and the money we were spending. I never said I was a part of the core team, so I believe it was just lost in translation or misconstrued.
Now, Grush first made his bombshell claims in an exclusive interview with NewsNation in June. That led to an historic congressional hearing last week, where he testified under oath that he's aware of a secret U.S. government program involving the recovery and reverse engineering of non-human craft. The Pentagon has continued to say it hasn't found, quote, verifiable information to support Grush's claims. In the new interview, Grush also addresses that pushback, alleging that the culture of secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project when the U.S. developed the atomic bomb also extends to UFOs.
Why, if it's true, has the government not acknowledged it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a multifaceted question. You know, it goes back, 80, 90 years ago when this was first created, and they, translated some of the secrecy from the Manhattan Project onto this subject because, they weren't sure how ontologically shocking it was going to be to the world populace. And then two, as you can imagine, it's a Pandora's box for, potential military and weapons development type reverse engineering activities. So they decided to keep it under wraps for many years.
And the chairman of the House Oversight Committee says more hearings on UFOs are to come. We're also waiting on a report from NASA. They're doing an independent study on UFOs. Their report on the subject is due this month. Nick?
Evan, thank you so much. Increasingly worried of what they could be encountering midair. Just in the last few years, there were about 6 reports made to the FAA describing, quote, unmanned aerial systems flying over Arizona's most restricted airspace. Some of these flying objects were spotted as high as 36,000 feet and flying up to nearly 600 miles per hour. Arizona has over a handful of military bases across the state, including the state's Air National Guard. These latest reportings are having some ask the question, what's really out there? Here with us now is Alex Dietrich, former military officer with the U.S. Navy with 22 years of experience, pioneering as one of the nation's first female strike fighter pilots. First of all, Lieutenant Dietrich, thank you so much for your service.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tell me your story. What made you speak out now?
Well, I haven't been withholding information or not speaking about this incident happened back in 2004, the Nimitz encounter, when we were conducting training exercises off the coast of San Diego. We reported it at the time. It was never classified because it is, a purely, truly unidentified encounter that we had. We don't know what it was, and we couldn't speculate at the time, and I won't speculate now. But ever since, there have been reports and investigations, and I'm certainly here to advocate today for a systematic reporting system to have the resources and the training and the mechanism so that when people do see something unusual, they have a way to report it, and that we have resources available, qualified teams to investigate and analyze and make sense of what we're seeing.
And Alex, more often than not, Lieutenant Dietrich, you all would discuss amongst yourselves, hey, did you see that? Yeah, I saw it too. And sometimes there was safety in others having seen or experienced the same thing.
Oh, please call me Alex. And sure, there's a stigma around the topic of UFOs, because of Hollywood and sci-fi, and we've made fun of it and snickered about these silly movies and books and shows that we watch. But really, if we see something in our airspace that we can't identify, we worry about national security. We worry about safety of flight. And, of course, all the scientists are going to say, we're curious and we should figure out what it is. And so, I'm hoping that by talking about it, it will reduce the stigma and people will be encouraged to share their stories with colleagues and, again, with officials who can actually do something about it.
And Alex, I'm glad that you pointed out the fact that you don't necessarily believe it's alien life form, but they're just objects you can't identify. Let's take a look at some of these. We're seeing everything that looks like a flying Tic Tac over Arizona. Describe some of these things that you saw while you were up there.
Right. So in November of 2004, my colleagues and I, we were in 2 aircraft with 4 air crew, 2 pilots and 2 weapons systems officers. And we saw visually what we describe as a Tic Tac because it looks like that little candy breath mint, sort of a matte white, oblong shape with no wings or smoke trail or anything that would indicate how it was turning or traveling in the way that it was. So I've heard other encounters described with different characteristics, and I wouldn't want to suggest that they are all related, that they have the same technology or the same origin. But what's important is that we have some standard template for debriefing, that we have some way to take in this information, to ingest it and make sense of it.
Absolutely.
And say, are these related?
And Alex, back when the DOD developed the B-52 bomber, people initially thought that was a flying object of some kind that they couldn't identify. Do you think this could also be some type of a system that's created that we just aren't aware of yet?
Sure. Well, I certainly hope that we have access to and control over this technology because and I'm referring to what I saw in 2004, at least. But I don't think it is because we wouldn't operate or we wouldn't test something in a range where we have a military exercise being conducted. We wouldn't put our blue forces at risk like that. So while I hope that, it is within our arsenal, I don't suspect that it is.
I love that. I'm glad that you made that distinction because even if it is something that we've created, we would not have flown and tested that object at the same time when you're doing training exercises. Lieutenant Dietrich, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Great, and thanks for taking this issue seriously.
Absolutely, and we'll continue to follow up on this, and we'll follow up with you again later. Thank you.
Capitol Hill to establish a select committee to investigate the extraordinary claims about unidentified flying objects. Marik von Rennenkampff's opinion piece, published today in TheHILL, is titled, "A Monumental UFO Scandal is Looming." And it's been TheHILL's top story today. So as we continue NewsNation's groundbreaking coverage of the UFO phenomenon, Marik joins us now live. Marik, thank you very much for joining us. You wrote today that there's one of 2 options here that's going on from the U.S. government: a decades-long cover-up or a staggeringly brazen psychological disinformation campaign. So my question to you is, what's to be gained in either scenario by the U.S. government? Why would they do that?
So it's a really good question, Mike, and thanks for having me, first of all. And I think I'm going to dive into the realm of speculation here, which I'm very uncomfortable doing. I'm much happier analyzing the facts as they exist. But if you believe the whistleblower, David Grush, in scenario 1, if there was in fact this decades-long UFO retrieval and reverse engineering effort, it was partially born out of potentially Cold War politics, but also a fear that the ontological shock, the societal shock of revealing this information would be too much, and there could potentially be societal unrest and political and social unrest. So that's one side of it. If we're dealing with a disinformation operation. This could potentially be, and again, I'm speculating and not comfortable doing so, but this could be to potentially, fool our adversaries into believing that we could potentially have remarkable technology. It could run the gamut. So that's my speculative answer.
Right. So all this got started with NewsNation's exclusive interview of the former Defense Intelligence or National Geospatial Agency official David Grush. He just testified before the House Oversight Committee, largely as a result of that interview that we did. And what I hear you guys, a lot of you folks saying who are experts who have looked at this for a long time, is that there's been a cover-up. Now, I've lived in Washington for a long time. I've covered Washington. If this has been going on for decades, if foreign governments have been involved, if aviators have been involved, if citizens have been involved, how have they been able to keep it secret so long? That's the one thing that I can't get past.
Mike, it's the million-dollar question, and I worked in the government previously, and I was extremely skeptical of the story when it first came out because I, from my experience, was in the same boat. But then I started looking back into kind of the history of the UFO story, and it turns out that there have been these rumors and leaks and deathbed confessions. They just never bubbled up to the surface. They always kind of stayed underground with these UFO circles. So the bottom line is, from my perspective, these rumors have been around for decades. They just never really saw the light of day the way they are now.
So in the 1970s, Carl Sagan popularized the saying, quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." We've heard some extraordinary claims. I don't think there's any question about that. But we've seen limited evidence. Now, the Tic Tac videos are unexplained. Even the Defense Department, the AARO, can't explain what those things were. But, are we at the point now where most Americans, do you think we've turned a corner where most Americans are going to start taking this seriously?
I think we're getting there. Now, I'm going to point to briefly to Senator Chuck Schumer's legislation, which is now passed the Senate and is now moving on to negotiations with the House. And it's basically it's pretty extraordinary. And I don't think many people have caught on to what is in this legislation. It mentions non-human intelligence 24 times. It discusses legacy programs of the sort that the whistleblower describes. It has a mandate for the exertion of eminent domain over any UFOs that are in the possession of private contractors. So that means the government would forcibly take control of such equipment and material. And that goes for non-human biologics as well. This is pretty extraordinary language that we see. So I think once this information filters out, if and when that does become law, I think we're going to see potentially much more coverage. And I think that will open up the aperture for the general public.